second and last video in this playlist addresses the actual testing of one of the non-boundary scan clusters using pseudo-random pattern generation and parallel signature analysis techniques. After watching this presentation, you will be able to explain what is the information required to carry out this type of test in a board, and also how you can obtain it. And finally, you will be able to set down a test procedure to carry out a PRPG-PSA test for the first cluster in our demonstration board. The first cluster is the one that is surrounded solely by boundary scan cells of test access port number 1. We have a representation of our cluster in this slide. The cluster is the one indicated in this photograph, as you may recall, and it is surrounded by boundary scan cells from devices IC3 and IC4, which are these two devices here. IC3 contains a number of boundary scan cells that will be used to drive the cluster inputs. So IC3 is the device that will be set in pseudo-random pattern generation mode. And the input pins of the second device are those that will be used to compress the signatures in parallel signature analysis mode. So this device will be set to PSA mode. Our objective is to carry out a pseudo-exhaustive test of this cluster. That is to say, using pseudo-random techniques, we will generate all possible input combinations. So we will actually carry out an exhaustive testing using pseudo-random techniques. What is the information that we have to know in order to carry out this test? Well, to start with, and in what concerns the pseudo-random generation part, we will have to know how many test clock cycles are required to generate all the possible 16 test vectors at the cluster inputs. How many clock cycles are required to generate all these 16 possible test vectors. In what concerns the device working in parallel signature analysis mode, we will need to find out what is the correct signature at the end. That is to say, if there are no faults present in the cluster, what is the expected signature that will be shifted out after our test is carried out. Well, we will split this in two parts and look first at the pseudo-random pattern generation part. Question, I repeat, is how to determine the required number of test clock cycles needed to cover all 16 possible combinations at the 4 cluster inputs. Well, the first alternative consists of using a general logic simulator, in which case we will have to develop a simulation mode for the pseudo-random pattern generation structure, which you have seen in a previous video, so that shouldn't be too difficult. Alternatively, however, we can use the Scan Educator package, which is an old simulation tool developed by Texas Instruments, and it was meant to explain the operation of the boundary scan logic inside these devices, and so it really offers an exact replica of the boundary scan architecture that is present in these components. It's an excellent utility, the only problem being that it is so old that you will actually require something like the DOS box in order to be able to run it in Windows. But once you have it up and running, then it will be very practical, because you can just load the initial seed value, and by ticking the TCK pin you will be able to check the sequence of logic combinations generated at the 4 pins driving the cluster inputs, and then you just have to cross each combination as it is generated until you have generated all 16 possible patterns. There would be a third alternative, which consists of running a real test session in step mode, that is to say, one TCK pulse at a time, and again with an oscilloscope or a logic analyzer, checking out the test patterns as they are generated and then crossing them out as each pattern is displayed. That isn't very practical, so the best alternative is indeed to use the scan indicator. When it comes to the second part, which is how to determine the correct signature at the end for signature analysis, you have the logic simulation tool alternative as well, but in this case that will be far more complex, because besides the simulation model for the pseudo-random pattern generator, you will need to have a simulation model for the cluster logic, and then also for the parallel signature analysis structure. So this is quite more complex than in the previous case. Happily, however, the lab alternative is much easier in this case, because if you make sure that there are no faults present, and then just after having found out how many test clock cycles you need, you carry out a real test run at full speed. You don't need to do it in step mode. Just carry out a real test run, driving the required number of TCK pulses, and at the end the PSA structure in this device will contain the fault-free signature that we need to know. So if you shift it out using our remote BST workbench tool, you can simply look at what has been shifted out and use it as the expected signature. Having reached this point, we are now in a position to explain what is the test procedure enabling us to carry out the PRPG-PSA test of this cluster. We have to start by shifting in the initial seed values for the PRPG block and for the PSA block, and to do so we will need to send in an instruction that selects the boundary scan register in the two devices. Sample preload will do fine, so we can start by loading the instruction register with sample preload in both devices, and then just shifting the initial seed values for PRPG in the left device and for PSA in the right device. Then we will need to set up the required operating mode, which is PRPG for the left device and PSA for the device on the right. And to do so, we will need to send in the boundary control register instruction, which is an optional instruction supported by these devices, and which selects a test data register called boundary control. After having loaded this instruction into the instruction registers of the two devices, we can shift in 01 to the device in the left and 10 to the device on the right. Finally, we are ready to load the boundary run test instruction, which is also an optional instruction supported by Texas Instruments in these devices. And after having done so, the remaining thing to do is just to apply the required number of test clock cycles as found out at this stage. When this number of test clock cycles has been applied, then the device in the right, that is to say this device here, will contain the fault-free or the faulty signature in its PSA structure. I leave it up to you to explain how we can shift this resulting signature out. So this test procedure takes us to the end of the test, but the only step that is not yet referred here is that the signature is now present in the device on the right. The question is, how do you shift it out?